All right, joining me now here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is Ken Wishnia. Ken is the author of several novels. His latest is entitled Red House, which you can find at kennethwishnia.com. Ken, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so Ken, before we get to your new novel, Red House, your work was actually brought to our attention because of an article you wrote for the website Alternet, and it was entitled 5 Reasons People Wanting to Change the World Should Read Crime Fiction. So, hey, let's get right to that. As a crime fiction novelist, why should progressives read crime fiction?
Well, one of the reasons, of course, is to support progressive writers like us. But I think a number of writers who sort of are of the same ilk as I politically encounter this problem that, we're writing for an audience that tends not to read fiction. I find a lot of progressives, particularly more activist types, they want documentaries, nonfiction, that's what really tells the story. And, of course, that's true in a sense. But, if you look at U.S. history, especially some of its literary history, it's often been novels that set fire to movements. In the South and before the Civil War, there were dozens and dozens of slaves who escaped north and were writing or dictating, escaped slave narratives. The best-selling one, of course, was Frederick Douglass's, which sold about 50,000 copies in, early 1850s, which is good numbers even today. But, Harriet Beecher Stowe's pastiche of all of those, she took inspiration directly from the slave narratives, sold 2 million copies. An unbelievable figure for the time. And, I think a key thing was that, as inspiring as Douglass was, he was threatening, in a sense, to a lot of the, polite New England abolitionist white audience. Here's this big, powerful, angry black man denouncing slavery, and as much as they supported him, I think, unfortunately, there was some emotional distance between the audience and him, whereas Harriet Beecher Stowe, was a minister's wife from polite New England, and, her opening chapter humanizes the slaves for other white women, in a way that previous narratives might not have. If anyone knows that book, which I find very difficult to read, but it was actually, the best-selling American novel for about 100 years. It takes the opening scene is a woman who's living in Kentucky, not that far from the Ohio River and the free state of Ohio, who overhears a conversation where her master is planning on selling her child into slavery. And, she grabs the baby and starts running, and it's winter, of course, so she's barefoot, and she's running through the woods, and there's snow on the ground, and there's ice on the river, and the bloodhounds are barking behind her. And, the narrator addresses the audience directly and says, if it were your child, that were about to be yanked away from you and sold into slavery, so they're already slaves, but sold south, to Mississippi, how fast would you run? So she points that, finger directly at the heart of, the white women readers. And I think, like it or not, that really sort of, it set fire to the abolitionist movement. There's the apocryphal story that Abe Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe and said, oh, so this is the little woman who wrote that book that started this war. It's hard to imagine a work of literature starting a war these days. It has to be a video nowadays.
Well, a work of fiction started the Iraq War, so that's the WMD report. So technically, fiction posing as fact.
Well, that's a big argument. Yeah, when people say, sort of, oh, why should activists read fiction? Or, the idea is, well, you do read the New York Times, right? And exactly, I think that's one of the key things is that, I guess the key thing is just that, in fiction, yes, you read nonfiction for the facts and the statistics and the horrors of what actually happened, but for a lot of people, it's not real to them until you dramatize it and stick a person in it that they can relate to. And then suddenly it's real.
That's a really, really great point. And just, I'm actually, I think myself personally, I kind of fall into that category. I don't read a lot of fiction. A lot of my time I'm spent, like you're saying, watching documentaries or reading nonfiction. But there's something where that fiction of the time gets, where it just colors the entire experience, and actually it's coming from a different place that gives you so much more texture than your kind of traditional history books or documentaries might actually give to you.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons I write crime fiction, I'm certainly attracted to it by some of the early masters of American hard-boiled school, like Dashiell Hammett in the 1920s, where, of course, lots of family fortunes were made doing illegal things like bootlegging, like the Kennedys made their money bootlegging. And, of course, if you're going to make that kind of money, well, you have to pay off all kinds of officials, from the beat cops all the way up to the mayor. And so what you had in the U.S. was, systemic corruption, system-wide corruption. And, Hammett treats this routinely, that, basically, oh, yes, the missing daughter of some wealthy industrialist. Well, of course, the guy made money in a way that, well, we're not going to discuss because that's too embarrassing to bring up. So, already as early as, basically 90 years ago, Dashiell Hammett is doing this, that, the newly rich all made their money doing things that are pretty shady and we're not going to talk about. But we all know what it is. So what else did you want to ask more specifically?
Well, let's talk a little bit more about some of the other reasons about that from the alternate article. One thing you kind of write about is how crime fiction actually exposes more of the social conditions itself, which is pretty interesting, where just the kind of conditions that surround everything. So talk a little about that.
Well, I'll actually, one of the authors I mentioned is a friend, Reed Farrell Coleman, and he denies that he's political, okay? But, I think one of the things going on is that in the U.S. today, his writing is political in the sense that one of the things he devotes a great deal of time and energy to in his novels is the long-term effects of violence and how it can ripple out and have ripple effects for years, even generations. He has a great line in one of his books: there are victims of the Holocaust who haven't been born yet. And, I just feel like it's a sad statement that in America today that counts as taking a political position because, really we have a media and especially a lot of a popular narrative that really does say, violence solves problems. For before 1970, something like 30% of all Hollywood films were Westerns, and in practically every single one of them, what happens? At the end, we have the inevitable showdown between the good guy with a gun and the bad guy with a gun, to use Wayne LaPierre's statement. And what always happens, well, the bad guy goes for his gun first, but the good guy, draws and shoots and kills him. And, of course, often rides off into the sunset because we have to recognize that, well, this guy is actually a killer and we can't have him in our civilization. But, for decades, Americans were given popular narrative that said, the limited use of violence by the right people, solves problems. And if you've looked at, frankly, we could question some of the things going on in World War II, but we'll leave that one alone. But basically every U.S. military action or intervention since then has tried to play on the World War II emotions. We're freedom's on the march and we're defending our way of life. You really want to know, how are we defending our way of life when we went into Vietnam or Iraq? These are sort of unaskable questions in commercial fiction in general, and at least crime fiction you can actually explore some of it. But as I say, a writer like Reed Farrell Coleman, he doesn't deal with politics the way I do. I actually have big corporations polluting large swaths of America. But frankly, I just feel we've reached a point where if you actually just say, violence has lots of negative effects that last for years and even decades, unfortunately in America today, that's a political position. You're not supposed to say stuff like that.
It's like, why do you hate America for saying something like that?
That's the narrative, right?